My name is Stephen Nunu. I'm a journalist, an education journalist at Edutopia. I'm a contributing editor, and I also write for other publications. We have a really great trio of panelists here to talk about EdTech ecosystems and the ESSER funding cliff, including Casey Rimmer. She's the executive director of curriculum and instruction for Union County Public Schools in North Carolina. We have Tal Havivi, the managing director of R&D at ISTE, and Melissa Label, who is the chief academic officer at Instructure. So the first thing I want to talk about a little bit about is that EdTech use is really sprawled in recent years. It has, with the ESSER funds expiring in September of 2024, administrators are really going to need to start thinking strategically about how to use their ed tech and making some hard decisions. So one of the biggest questions that we got was how many ed tech tools are being used. And according to last year's EdTech Top 40 report published by Instructure, districts are using an average of nearly 2,600 EdTech tools annually. That is a ton of EdTech. And as leaders look at these big numbers, many are wondering just how they move from the emergent purchasing decisions of the pandemic to something a little bit more thoughtful, a refinement of their digital ecosystems. And the need for this is being recognized. The most recent 2024 National EdTech Plan calls out the importance of careful vetting and implementation to close digital learning divides. So with that in mind, we're going to dive into some of these topics, and then we're going to give you a chance to ask some questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any good questions while we're doing the webinar, I really encourage you to put those in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end. So I want to start this conversation by talking a little bit about what an effective EdTech ecosystem actually looks like. And that can look like a lot of different things. But I want to start by asking you, Tal, whether, from the macro level, do educators really know what tools are available to them, and do district leaders know what's being used?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So let me just take a step back. And I think okay, today is February 28th, 2024. Almost 4 years to the date is when schools shut down, right? 4 years minus 3 weeks or something. And if we just go back to that time, awful time, there was an influx of ed tech, right? There was, even before COVID funding flowed in, a lot of ed tech providers were saying, hey, we're just going to offer our products to you for free. And school districts reacted very differently to that. Some school districts who already had strong ed tech ecosystems said, look, we have our plan, we have our strategy, we're just going to continue remote. And others said, we don't have a plan yet. We were totally not expecting a pandemic to happen. And we're just going to take whatever we can find and use. And as a result, there's a lot of different ed tech that's been accumulated into ed tech ecosystems in this period where we went from fully remote to hybrid to back to in-person. And we're at this point now where, as Stephen mentioned, there's sort of this quote unquote strategic culling that is happening. As ESSER funding is ending, school districts are really having to take a hard look at what are the critical parts of this ecosystem. And the ways in which they're doing so vary. One of those ways of evaluating what good ed tech means is from purely an IT perspective, right? A student data privacy perspective and an interoperability perspective. Those are really important to make sure that they're deployed appropriately within a school district. There are other perspectives too, those around diversity, those around quality, right? Is the product designed in a way that's researched back? And then there's, interestingly, other ways that are specifically around procurement that are outcomes-based contracting. Are school districts, requiring ed tech providers to say, we'll give you some money now, and if you reach the outcomes that we agree upon, we'll give you the rest of the money later. So there's a lot of ways that to build an effective ecosystem, an effective EdTech ecosystem. And the truth is, it's just hard. It's a hard thing to do to evaluate EdTech. And so different organizations, different school systems are taking different approaches.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to switch over to Casey. Can you tell us a little bit about your district and also whether you have a sense of whether educators know what tools are available to them and whether your district leaders know what tools are being used or and how they're managing that?
Sure. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to share a little bit about what we've been doing in Union County Public Schools to kind of help answer some of these questions. Um, so we have been customers of Learn Platform since prior to COVID, right? So thankfully, we had Learn Platform to be able to help our teachers identify what products were approved, but also to ask and request products that weren't yet approved to be vetted. And so I think that that's really important. And I would say prior to us really kind of outlining Learn Platform as the tool to do that, there was really some ambiguity about what is approved and what teachers are allowed to use. And not only that, but if products were not approved or they were not on the list, there was kind of some question about what was the reason? Why were those products not approved? And I think the more that we really kind of put that out in front of folks, the things that we're looking for, right? What are the things that we think are important? The alignment to the curriculum, student data privacy, safety, things like that are really important to us. And the more that we kind of champion a process for requests and to see approval, the more knowledgeable our teachers are. So I would say that absolutely, are there some products in our district that are being used that maybe leadership doesn't know about? Could be. But one of the things that we also utilize with Learn Platform is we have an app extension that measures or that kind of captures the ad tech products that are being used. And as a district, we can monitor, right? What are our top 10 products? And so I want our top 10 products to be those products that we invest in. We invest money, we invest time, we invest professional learning in. And sometimes I can see maybe some free products creeping up there. And so that allows us to kind of make some decisions about what is the current reality, what are the teachers actually using, what are the students actually using, and what are the things that we want to kind of encourage folks to use more and things like that. So not only do we have a library that shows what's been approved, we have a process for approval, and we also have a way to kind of check back to say, are they using the products that we think that they're using? And we do all that through Learn Platform, which is pretty handy when it comes to talking about and understanding what is happening in your ed tech ecosystem.
Yeah, that's great. Really quick follow-up for you, Casey. Were there any surprises or takeaways that you quickly wanted to share from the review of that data?
Not any real surprises. One of the things that I have been monitoring the last couple of years, especially during COVID or after, the time following COVID specifically, is we were really focusing on our teachers utilizing Canvas as our LMS. We thought that everyone, K-12 utilizing that LMS was really important. It simplified things for students and for parents. And we had, I would not say other LMSs, but we had people using other products. And we have been able to watch other products kind of fall down the list as in maybe our top 10 products, right? And that's the intended outcome. So no surprises, but really happy to see kind of some of those things that we're doubling down on, things like our LMS or, creation products that we're really encouraging teachers and students to use. We really can find success when we see those competitors and some of those maybe products that are not as robust fall a little bit lower on the list.
Yeah, that's great. Melissa, I want to turn to you. Can you tell us just a bit about your role at Instructure? And my question for you was why educators or why district leaders should be encouraging educators to really care about this unmanaged technology and the implications for that?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I am in a new role for Instructure. It's called our Chief Academic Officer. And my purpose is to bring together conversations, thought leadership, best practices from the education community and curate those out, reflect on those, and help educators, help organizations and institutions think best about how they are leveraging educational technology tools in the broader learning journey of our students. So it's really just these kinds of conversations, not only being a part of them, but hoping to surface up some really great insights like we are here today to be able to bring back to the broader education community. And I think what both of my fellow panelists have touched on is the value of having teachers, students, parents, districts be aware and thoughtful about the management of their educational technology ecosystem, because there's a lot at play there. There's everything from the resources needed to manage those 2,600 tools that you mentioned at the beginning. There's the efficacy, making sure that the tools that are being leveraged are being leveraged in the way they are intended to be leveraged and are having the outcomes desired. There's things like safety, security, privacy, and there's a lot out there that teachers and students can tap into, but not everything has the intentionality that's needed to be a secure, a private, a meaningful tool in the education construct. So I think it's really important. I mean, I think back to the days when we first started using the internet in education, and we needed to bring digital literacy to the forefront, both for teachers and for students, and even for parents. It's the same thing now. It's not just digital literacy, but it's tool literacy and understanding as a user, what does that mean for you, and being able to pick and choose the best tools for your own, student growth. So I think it's really important that districts, parents, teachers, students all are aware of the tooling that's being used and are able to make thoughtful decisions guided by leaders at districts around that tooling to support learning.
Yeah, that's great. That's definitely something I would love to drill down into, that tool literacy. Tao, can you talk a little bit about that, about how whether educators understand how specific tools are intended to be used and kind of the training portion?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say, like, it may even be helpful to know, like, what are teachers up against when they know, like, what tool is available for them to be used. You have a district administrator who says, here are the tools that are approved and available to you. And what they're up against typically is word of mouth and Google, both of whom are pretty powerful. And so I think there's part of this conversation around how do we get to an educator level for them to understand what good looks like, what does good ed tech look like, and how to implement it. So part of it is, as I mentioned before, it's really hard to evaluate what good ed tech means. And when you talk to an educator and say, what's your favorite tool? And they'll say XYZ. And if you ask, why is that your favorite tool? Oftentimes I've heard responses like, it's really engaging for students, or it's super simple to use. Or for example, if it's a middle school coding application and the teacher doesn't know how to code, they say, I learn alongside the kids. And those are all things that a teacher experiences, but in order to articulate that in a way that can be translated into what makes a good product is challenging. There's very few people in the world who are both true educationalists and technologists. And you really have to have a common language to be able to understand, my students are really engaged. What does that actually look like as it relates to a set of product features? So from some of the work that we've done is really trying to set out to define, what does teacher usability mean? And we've broken that out into pedagogical usability of ed tech tools, meaning how does a tool support, guide, enable educators to practice research-based instruction? And then also technical usability. Is this product easy to navigate? Does it chunk information in meaningful ways? Does it have a breadcrumb trail? Just simple UX work. And so part of the work is educating classroom educators on, and ed tech coaches and district administrators on, what does teacher usability mean? And that can really help support identifying high quality products.
Yeah, that's great. Casey, I wanted to talk a little bit about this usage gap. You know, leaders expect XYZ to be used, but teachers aren't using it, as Tal was alluding to. How can how can school leaders and districts really understand that EdTech usage with an eye towards closing those usage gaps and getting everyone on the same page?
Sure. I think it starts really with understanding why teachers are choosing to use a different product. And sometimes, like Tel said, it's because it's easier to navigate, right? And so I think as a district, it's our job to help them feel confident and learn more about and do some professional learning around that product, right? And really kind of sell the product to our teachers. So it's either that, right? And I really kind of hate to say this, but sometimes a product could be amazing and it's the most amazing product, but if a teacher is either doesn't want to use it or avoids it, or then it's not a great product and it's just not a good fit for you. And so sometimes we have to make really hard decisions. um Sometimes there's great products and we have to say the product, even though it's an amazing robust tool that does amazing things for other schools and districts, maybe it's not doing that for us. And so sometimes those gaps mean that we have to consider looking for something else or looking elsewhere or changing our practices, because even if a product is good, but no one is using it, it's not really impacting student learning. And that's really what it's all about. So if we have to shift gears as leaders, we can do that as well. But I think it really starts with learning from our teachers the why of why they are not using the product, or why they are going in another direction.
Yeah, yeah, and those are tough decisions. No, for sure. I appreciate that response. Melissa, you had mentioned earlier that part of your role is surfacing best practices, and I think that's a really interesting role. There are, like, as everybody knows, there's a lot of expenses with EdTech, including adoption, training, and ongoing, licensing fees. Can you talk a little bit about what budget considerations leaders should be thinking about when assessing what ed tech they want to keep and making some of those difficult decisions, as Casey was talking about?
Yeah, it's such an important point. Um, Understanding what is being used and why it's being used, just like Casey and Tal described, is so critical because resources are finite. There is a lot of different ways that a district and leaders can choose to invest those resources, both people resources and dollar resources. And if you have a vast and disparate education technology ecosystem, you can be spending money. There could be duplicates, tools that do similar things. And, it just happens to be a favorite of a certain set of teachers versus another set. That could be a waste of resources, or an opportunity, more importantly, to take those resources from one of those tools and then invest it elsewhere in initiatives in the district. You could also find places where the cost of those technologies isn't aligning to either the usage or the impact back to how is this playing a role in the success metrics that we have for individual student learning. So there's complexities there as we think about budget. It's not just, keep the stuff that's being used and get rid of the stuff that isn't, but it's there's a layer beneath that of thinking about how and where are we investing our resources and dollars as a district and as leaders, and then how does that align to the kind of usage we want to encourage at that level by teachers.
Yeah, and that sounds like it takes a significant amount of pre-planning, right, Melissa?
Yeah, it definitely takes pre-planning. It also takes thoughtful leadership. I think the folks on my fellow panelists are really great examples of that. You need to first understand where are you at and what's being used, while building what do you want to see from your EdTech ecosystem, and then you can start to match the two together. So depending on your district or learning goals, you can then think about how do we achieve those effectively with the tools that are either being used or could be used, given the direction and efficacy, that pedagogical effectiveness and technology effectiveness that was talked about. How can we marry the two? But that surveying of the landscape first is really important. while you're building that strategy. And then you can start making those valuable decisions to invest your resources in the best ways.
Yeah, yeah. I want to move on to the next pillar, which is talking about supporting this EdTech ecosystem. And so I wanted to start with you, Tal. We had talked a little bit earlier in the conversation about I think it was Casey who brought up making sure that teachers understand the why behind the decisions. So I wanted to ask you about the best ways to communicate these EdTech decisions to staff and really helping them to understand the why and what we need to be considering for that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question, and it sort of begs the additional question of what is the responsibility of an educator in all of this, right? Like educators have so much on their plate. This is not a new problem. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we were talking about teacher burnout. We're talking about how teachers have an ever growing list of things that they have to manage from, going just from one class to multiple classes to social emotional components to several different pieces in terms of preschool, after school work. So teachers have a lot on their plate. And so I think as part of your question, I'll reframe it as how can we make sure teachers know what good looks like without adding a lot to their plate? And one of those answers is simply like if the school district does have an EdTech management system, an EdTech ecosystem that's formalized, just building in that sort of automatic behavior of like, let's check what's approved. And in so many school districts, like that small behavior change, that change management is not quite done effectively, which leads to this sort of leaky bucket of so many new EdTech products coming in. So just making sure educators know they are supported in terms of the curation and approval of EdTech products. The other thing I'll say is if that process doesn't exist yet in a school district, there are market validators in the world. There are folks who are validating for student data privacy. There are folks who are validating for interoperability. These are trusted third-party organizations who sort of help create these market validators so that school systems don't have to do it for every single EdTech product they use. Not every EdTech product needs to be evaluated with the same level of rigor, right? If it's a core curriculum product, that's really important. It's going to be used every day by a large group of people. I think the state of the market today is there are a long tail of EdTech products that are used for 20 minutes a week by a teacher. And like those EdTech products should be high quality, but we probably not only do we not have to, but school districts don't have the capacity to do that level of evaluation. So I think knowing where your friends are in the ecosystem and what are trusted sources are a good way to support sort of this procurement education for educators and school systems.
Yeah, that's great. Casey, I just wanted to circle with you and talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice, especially about this really interesting point that Tal just brought up about core curriculum products versus ancillary tools and how you communicate this why to your teachers.
So actually, I think the interesting part about this is that I feel like I have been the dream killer when it comes to EdTech tools for our teachers for like the last 12 to 15 years. And while some of this is new, right? We broke the news to some of our teachers many years ago that the terms of service was something that they had to look at, right? And the age requirement. So we had a lot of teachers who just didn't know to look there. And I was in a technology role at the time. And so we really started championing our teachers to look at the terms of service and look at the privacy policy and see if there was age limits. And so fast forward, 10, 15 years, now we're really talking about data privacy with student data. And that's kind of like our dream killer now. So when people say, see, I asked for this product and it's denied, I need to understand why. And so it used to be, we would say, well, did you look at the terms of service, the age says, or the use case or whatever. But now we're really able to say, unfortunately, it's been denied because the company won't agree to our terms for data privacy, which is really important. And no teacher in the world is going to be like, oh, well, let's use it. Like every teacher's like, oh, well, now that I understand, that's good. And so we actually build in some practices to have teachers ask, right? What is the age requirement? So we ask those questions when they request a product. So that helps to kind of build into their brain that they need to know the answers to those questions. And so that really helps. That doesn't necessarily answer your question, Stephen, about curriculum and core versus, we call it in my district, we call it supplemental. But we have two separate practices according to our board policy for adoption of resources. The one is for core, and that's for things that the district pushes out. And then one is for what we call supplemental. And those are the things that the teachers bring to the table. And so we're doing a lot of work around helping teachers to understand the different processes and what they need to do if they want to bring something into their classroom, whether it's a print resource or it's an EdTech product. There's still kind of some criteria that we need to make sure that it's contributing to the pathway and the work that they are striving to do in their classroom, right? Aligned with curriculum, all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I do want to move on in the interest of time to this third pillar, which is sustaining the EdTech ecosystem and talking a little bit about evaluation and what data we're really using. There's quantitative and there's qualitative data that districts can be using. Melissa, can you talk a little bit about some of those considerations? We all know, about student scores and, how much time on task and how much time teachers are spending. What are some of these quantitative and qualitative data points that districts can be using in their decision-making process?
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about what should be used and why. I think then once you've curated this collection of tools to be used, the next step is to ensure that they are continuing to be used in the way they are meant, and to also surface up data and insights into, are they having that pull through impact that we want to see. So you already mentioned on student performance or student engagement. There's a lot of there's qualitative aspects to this that we can see. If this tool is meant to deepen skills in certain areas, can we see that as we look at our key district indicators? And that's definitely a quantitative piece. There's also that qualitative piece to do around each of these tools that surface, and that qualitative should be about, is this the right experience that represents our district, our goals, and does it help teachers, first of all, create deeper connection with their students, perhaps, or address areas of deficiencies, or engage students in new areas that they might be interested in. And then similarly, from a student perspective, that qualitative level is, does this help me understand myself as a learner? Does this help me think about how I can, does this help me understand and move along my learning path, whether it be in a very young age or on through to, graduate and move on to post-secondary. So it's really the indicators need to be aligned to the most important district indicators, and where leadership is looking to either take on opportunities or address challenges, or both. The good news is the research that you can do around these tooling, just by seeing how it's being used and where it's being used. If you have a good originating data set, you can start to correlate those against other performance indicators, and you should be out there getting feedback from teachers and students on how do they feel about these tools, what role do they play and why. I saw there was a question that has come in asking about overusage, not just underusage. That's a great qualitative indicator. Okay, why is it being overusage? Isn't necessarily a good thing. So following up with, why is this being overused? How is it being used? Not only can that evaluate the tools in aggregate, you can start to identify teachers and opportunities for professional development therein.
Yeah, that's great. Tal, is overusage something you've come across in your R&D work?
Totally. I mean, I think there is this very real, under talked about challenge. I should say, I'm a bit of an EdTech curmudgeon. I love EdTech. I want EdTech sector to be successful. And I'm a bit of a curmudgeon, and like one of the things I worry about is there's really engaging ed tech that may not actually be leading to the outcomes, right? Leading to student improvements. And so an example in like situations like that, where there's a really engaging ed tech product, but it doesn't actually help a student grow, then, and 1 minute of it is over usage. And so like, I think there is, that's definitely part of the conversation. I also think like going back to a couple of the points Melissa made, there's like three phases, I'd say. Like the first is like the gates into the school district. How are we evaluating what's the best way that we can guess that this product will work in our school district? And there's a lot of upfront work that goes into that, around usability, around interoperability, data privacy, evidence, things but evidence not of if it works in your school district, did it work in school districts like yours, right? You don't know yet for your school district. Then there's the implementation phase, which is a lot of that mix of qualitative and quantitative. And then I think towards the end of a cycle, being able to say, do we feel good about this product? And only at the end of the cycle, I think a lot of times school districts will run into the challenge of saying like, I wish we communicated early what good looked like to the provider. It's said another way, like, does this provider support me in this evaluation, or am I totally on my own? And like so like the language I've been using is the product designed with research? And then is it designed for research? Meaning, at the beginning of beginning of using a product, can you ask your ed tech product or the ed tech provider, hey, will I be able to look 12 months from now and see if I reached the goal that I wanted to reach with this? Will you help me with that research? Is a good question to ask to help with that entire evaluation and keep you and an ed tech provider on the same page throughout your use of their product.
Yeah, that's great. Casey, I wanted to circle back with you just a little bit about how your leaders decide what outcomes they're going to prioritize when they're making decisions, and kind of what some of those look like.
Sure. So first, we absolutely look at usage, right? I think that's really important. But you can't make decisions based on usage alone. And one of the things that I kind of always say is sometimes the only person looking at usage is the person who made the contact to buy the product, like at a school, right? Let's say that they're buying a product and it's the bookkeeper because she made the connection. Sometimes the bookkeeper is the only one that's getting the usage reports. And so no one's even looking at that. So, sometimes that's really important to look at usage. I would not look at usage alone. When we make district-wide purchase decisions, we look at usage. We also utilize Learn Platform to send requests to our teachers to give us feedback. And they have a really great rubric that asks teachers things like, how often do you use it? Which subgroups? Do you use it, for enrichment? Do you use it for remediation? Do you use it for core? So it gives us some really good feedback when the teachers complete that. And we usually do that around budget season. So most of our teachers kind of know to expect that. And they know that we make decisions based on that, which I think is really important. When possible, we also use the impact analysis. And Melissa kind of talked a little bit about that with correlating achievement data with usage data to say, if this product is really having this much of an impact on student learning. The really interesting thing and that I really enjoy asking and talking about is students and how do they feel about the product. And so, Melissa, this is just a little plug that I would love to see student feedback options. And we've played with this and I've talked with Learn for a really long time, but I want to ask students how they feel about the product. And I want to get just as much feedback from them as we get from the teachers. More importantly, I want to show the teachers what they think versus what the students think. Because to go back to the overuse conversation, if a teacher, and if we think about secondary, if a teacher is using a product in first period and they're only using it once a week, but then the student's second period teacher is using it and their third, then they might use it 4 times in one day, right? And the teachers, that might not come up for the teachers because they don't recognize that they're using the same product or there's repetition there, but the students feel that. And so that tool fatigue kind of is a big deal for kids. And I think that we could trust our secondary kids to give us, even our elementary kids, we could trust our kids to give us honest feedback about how they feel about products. And I don't think we do that one enough.
Yeah, that's great. We did get a question in the chat about whether the usage from the vendor, is matches your experience. Casey, can you talk a little bit about your experience? Do you generally trust what the data that you're getting back? Does it match with your experience?
Sure. So I absolutely usually trust the usage from the vendor, but I don't usually want the vendor to tell me about my students' achievement in their product. Usually I like to use my numbers, my achievement scores, and then I correlate those through Learn Platform so that I'm using my numbers. Because I think there is a little bit of, of an opportunity to make something look like if a vendor is looking to get you to renew, you know, um, they absolutely could show you in a way that is for in support of utilizing their product. So I always tell folks, sometimes they send me some of those reports and I say thanks. I like to use my numbers and run my reports and do my own analysis, and I can compare those sometimes. But that allows me to compare apples to apples whenever I can across the district, right? Because if somebody's sending me effectiveness reports based on lessons, and then another product is based on minutes used, and another product is based on something else, then I'm not really looking across, commonality. So if I set that up and I do that analysis, I can get it as alike as possible so I can look from one product to another.
And
Yeah.
if I might add to that, definitions are going to vary from vendor to vendor. They're going to interpret things like engagement and performance. There's a lot of things out there that vendors will look at differently and use different data points to drive those reports. So I think what Casey is saying is so spot on. Not only to be able to align consistently and look at apples to apples, but to also ground the data that you're getting from vendors against your own definitions of those either terms or outcomes or indicators.
Yeah, that's great. Melissa, can I follow up? One of the impetuses for this conversation was the ESSER funding cliff, or this, impending funding cliff. Can you talk a little bit, about what districts can be doing to kind of minimize this impact and what they should be thinking about now?
Yeah, it is so important to be thinking about this now. In fact, I would say, you should have been thinking about this potentially a couple months ago at the very least, because one of the things that I think has happened over the last couple of years is there has been a pretty significant proliferation of new technologies and this acceptance of experimenting or trying new technologies. That's a good thing, but it's also led to lots of technologies being used. And I think what districts are, rather than just looking for places to cut dollars because funding is changing, it's more looking for places where they can continue to take advantage of the fact that educators are accepting in a different way and excited about in a different way technologies, and then picking the right ones for that district. So I still see investment districts wanting to build ecosystems, but they need to do it where they can have the most effective or the largest return on investment with reduced funding coming. We use dollars to try everything. Well, we've tried it all. Now we got to pick what's going to be the most important. So districts should be in that process, thinking about what tools, and not just straight up using usage, or as Casey and Tal have talked about, not just using what vendors are telling you, but really reflecting for yourself on what is the most impactful so you can pick and choose in the right ways. The other thing is, I think then you can also invest your resources to sustain those choices. Because just making things available that are good tools and aligned to the right, pedagogical approaches and are technically sound isn't enough. It's also creating the training and the context around that, informing not only teachers, but students how and why they're being used, and parents. There's a growing need to be able to have parents understand how and why are their children, especially at home, using these technologies. So it gives you twofold, right? You can make some good decisions if you're evaluating these early and often, but it also around your budget, but it also helps you understand where should you invest resources around those to do things like that development, to do integration, to be able to see the right kinds of data sets and really get the most bang for your buck with the tools that you select.
Yeah, that's great. I just wanted to touch on a similar point with you, Tal, how districts can really be maximizing their time and resources, if they are worried about having fewer resources next year or in the coming years.
Yeah, just adding on to what Melissa said, and maybe just like saying it in slightly different words. Like I think, right, this is a human problem less than a technical problem. Sorry, more than a technical problem. Meaning, like I think there's three components that must be true in order to effectively teach students with technology. Like the first is there needs to be a coherent instructional vision. How do we want to make the changes we want to make in the school system? The second is we need to have prepared teachers, meaning are the teachers equipped to make those changes? Are we providing them the professional learning that they need to make those changes? And then the third is the supportive tech, right? Are we purchasing the technology that will support the teachers who are going to drive that vision, and that will create the change, right? So I think it's vision, prepared teachers, supportive tech, and that will lead to the outcomes. But any one of those pieces is missing, then I don't think you have a successful cocktail. Right? You can't have really great technology but no vision and no prepared teachers. You can't have really great teachers but no vision and no technology to support them. Those three components must be true. And I think that is maybe a clarifying way to think about what are the critical components of our EdTech ecosystem by starting with vision, then going to capacity, and then going to the actual technology that will sort of support teachers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Casey, I did want to talk a little bit about, funding and resources in your district. There's an interesting question in the Q&A relating to negotiation on EdTech products. Can you talk a little bit about whether that fits into your strategy and how you think about, when it's time to renew licenses or time to adopt a new product, what are the conversations and considerations that you're thinking about when it comes to different vendors?
Sure. So I'm in a relatively large district in the state of North Carolina. So we have 53 schools. And so sometimes it makes better sense for us to kind of get some consensus between those 53 schools to see if we can capitalize on bulk pricing, right? And sometimes that means that my district might, or my office might negotiate, hey, we have 15 schools who are interested. Instead of each of those schools negotiating by themselves, sometimes I help to kind of monitor that and support them in that way so that they can get the best price. That is one strategy, right? And really the key to that is getting everyone on board at the same time, because that's not going to necessarily play out if you have 10 schools who want to start in August, and then you have 2 in September, and then 2 in October who are like, oh, I really want to get in on that. So you can't really benefit. So you have to really kind of front load the leadership with what is available and what those opportunities are. And I would say that our leadership really appreciates that opportunity, but it benefits them as well. I also look at, what is the difference between buying a product for 30 schools and 53? Like sometimes if 30 schools are purchasing it, what is the cost to add all the rest of the schools, right? And so we try and look at as many different scenarios as possible to see how we can get the most bang for our buck when we are negotiating with a vendor.
Yeah.
One thing that I'll also add is that I try and do really hard that's been really, really successful for me is to make sure that our contract terms always run, and we choose August 1st to the end of July. So I don't have any products that expire in October, right? And that makes it a really clean break. If we decide to discontinue a product, teachers don't get halfway through the school year and then the product is gone. So I had to do a lot of prorated. I did some 16-month agreements. I did some 13-month agreements, but I've got pretty much every one of our products now run from August 1st to July 1st or 31st or 30th. I don't. But anyway, the end of July, right? And so that is really helpful because you're feeling a little bit of pressure when you have teachers in the middle of October saying, I need this product. I used it yesterday and now it's gone. And so it makes it just a little bit easier. So you have a little more leverage when you're talking with vendors that way.
That's great. That's great. And before we wrap, I'd be remiss if I didn't get to a question from my friend Nadia, for Tal, about data privacy and considerations that inform, training and also adoption. What should districts really be looking for when it comes to data privacy, Tal?
Yeah, a couple things, and I see Nadia's question in the Q&A. From an ed tech perspective, I used to work at a few different ed tech companies. A lot of school districts have different data privacy agreements. So especially for smaller ed tech companies, it can be challenging with limited capacity to make sure that they can, in good faith, sign every single agreement, particularly because a lot of the technology that they're offering you may not be theirs, right? They may be, for example, using a speech recognition artificial intelligence that's from a big tech company, and they don't really know where that data is going, right? It's going to that big tech company, and they don't get to choose where it goes. And so that may be a reason that they can't, in good faith, sign a contract. Though I think, like, in terms of answering your question around student data privacy, I'll go back to my comment earlier on market validators. There are a number of mostly nonprofit ed tech intermediaries who really focus on student data privacy. Common Sense Media is one of them. The Student Data Privacy Pledge is another one. There's a few others that I'm failing to think of right now. And essentially, a lot of the work they do is scroll through ed tech providers' privacy policies and says, hey, this is good or not good. And they give badges. They give, like, for Common Sense, they give a bad, moderate, and good. And you can find that either on their website or something that ISTE has is the product index. That is essentially a place where we aggregate a lot of different ed tech market validators into one place. So you can go to edsearch.index.com and search for a product, and you'll see all of the validators that the ed tech provider has, from digital pedagogy to accessibility to student data privacy to interoperability to evidence soon, hopefully, will all be on the product index.
Yeah.
Could I just add on to that real quick? I'm sorry. One of the things that we see negotiations kind of happen back and forth between our legal counsel and the ed tech product, until you bring up a really good point. We run into some school districts don't have, legal counsel on, they have to pay. They don't have them as part of their staff. We're lucky enough to do that. But the same thing goes for ed tech companies. And so sometimes it's not worth an ed tech company for them to even review our data sharing agreement, because they would have to pay, some legal for some feedback and things like that. So sometimes, especially if it's a free product, they're like, we just can't, right? And our paid products that we go back and forth with, sometimes really the number of hours after a breach is like the most controversial thing. And so while my district might say 48 hours or 72 hours, the district next door might say a different set of hours. And so I recognize that that's a really hard thing for ed tech products, right? Because everybody's got a little bit different. I will shout out to North Carolina. They're trying to streamline that so that the state of North Carolina has an agreement. And once you're in that, you're approved in the state of North Carolina, then everybody can benefit from that. And then we don't have to, fight that. So that's promising news. And I'm really excited about simplifying that process, because it is, not only am I the dream killer because it doesn't happen, but it's really a heavy lift for both sides to be able to work through that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Any closing thoughts, Melissa, before we wrap?
No, I think the panelists have done an outstanding job giving some really great practices and feedback to the community. The one last thing on this last question, One EdTech also has a trusted apps listing that you can leverage as well. That's incorporated in things like Learn Platform. So look for, if you're going to use tooling, looking for those seals and looking for where those different listings reference each other can also be really helpful, because now you have multiple validation points.
That's great. I just really want to thank Melissa, Casey, Tal. Thank you so much for being part of our webinar today. Before we leave, I just wanted to direct your attention to a guide from Learn Platform, Building a Stronger EdTech ecosystem. You can access the guide using the QR code right here. It's a really great resource. I hope you'll check it out. And once again, thank you to everybody for attending and asking questions and making this a really great webinar. Thanks so much, and we hope to see you soon.